The Ukraine is a country in turmoil. Russian-speaking citizens in its eastern regions have poured into the streets to protest against the US-backed administration in Kiev, also raising concerns in embassies all over the world, including the Russian embassy here in London. In turn, that administration has responded by cancelling Russian-language television programming and imposing a harsh regime. Some protesters have now taken control of government buildings and called for a federal, localised Ukraine to replace the rulers in Kiev. The West originally supported the armed militants who overthrew the elected government in Kiev. US Secretary of State John Kerry even praised their efforts, citing their right to associate with partners who will help them realise their aspirations. Yet, a short while later, Mr. Kerry condemned armed militants in eastern Ukraine, claiming their attacks were orchestrated and synchronised. So, what's going on? Why can such contradictions exist in Western foreign policy? And what should happen next? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. And we began by finding out how much the public actually knows about the situation in the Ukraine. Here's what they said. What have you heard about what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment?
I read the newspapers, so I...
What have you read about the Ukraine in the papers?
Well, some parts of the Ukraine wish to rejoin Russia, and some parts don't.
I think it's not just a sudden thing. So it's been building up for some time, and now is the sad culmination of the build-up of things, and it's not just political. It's more deeper than that. So it's economies, and then there's a constant fight between East and West, and America.
I think, is it where the war is?
Yeah, tell me more about that.
I've just seen it on telly where the war is and how bad it is, really.
What do you know about what's been going on in the Ukraine recently?
I suppose I've picked a fair bit up from, I listen to Radio 4 a lot, and I read the papers as well, so I've picked up that there's quite a lot going on in Ukraine at the moment.
Good or bad?
I think it's probably something sort of in between. Clearly there are a number of people that are pro-Russian speakers in the eastern part that are quite happy to join Russia, but that means the disintegration of the Ukraine, which I can understand that those in Kiev are not at all happy about.
Well, mainly what I have seen on television and on the news, certainly the occupation of Ukraine by the Russians, and that it seems to be unwanted and unheralded, so it seems to be something that would be better not happening.
Essentially, there's been a lot of sort of civil unrest and a bit of a kind of civil war. Russia and America both seem to be intervening too, and that's the size of it, as far as I gather.
So quite a lot of awareness amongst the public about the problems in the Ukraine. We turn to our experts for an analysis of what's really going on in that very troubled country.
The most important thing to understand about what's going on in Ukraine is that essentially it's an inter-imperial conflict. A conflict that is between the United States and its European allies, the dominant imperial complex in the world, who are trying to draw Ukraine into their axis of alliances, in the first instance the European Union, and Russia, the dominant imperial power in the region, which for precisely the same reason is trying to stop that happening, because it would lead to what the Russian leaders fear would be Moscow's encirclement by Western aligned states.
Well, what has been happening in the Ukraine is, in my view, a manifestation of good old-fashioned Russian paranoia. This is the determination for the Kremlin authorities to create a buffer zone. This has been an objective of Soviet power and of Russian power, and I don't really see that anything has changed except fear in Moscow that the Ukraine was going to become part of NATO.
How much can we trust what our politicians and what the press and the media in general are telling us about developments in the Ukraine? Is there a built-in bias? Here's the public's view. Whose side are Western governments and the mainstream media taking, in your opinion?
Well, they're always the side of capital, I guess. Yeah. So yeah, the side of their business interests. Yeah.
You know, we seem to be so keen on sort of pleasing foreign nationals to come to this country that we're scared, frankly, of actually making any fuss.
Certainly, I guess we're getting the viewpoint, but it's probably more about Ukraine itself and less favourable to Russia.
Do you feel that Western coverage and Western governments have taken a particular side in that dispute?
Well, the government certainly have. From a coverage viewpoint, you assume Western coverage is more objective than certainly Russian, but that's an assumption, I suppose.
No, I don't think so. I think what's being reported is probably fairly accurate.
Actually, I think that we are getting a very pro-Western view, and I think it's interesting when the BBC go and talk to, say, the Voice of Russia, and you get a very different opinion. Now, it may be equally biased, but I think at the moment it's really I find it quite hard to make up my mind. There's one guy that the BBC interviewed, he's an ex-general or something, or an ex-ambassador, and he actually seems to me speaks good sense, because he says the Russians have got a legitimate complaint, particularly that the West has tended to be very dismissive of Russia since the fall of the USSR, and now they're reaping the price. So,
is there a definitive answer to the question, are our politicians and our media biased for or against the Ukraine? Here's what our expert said.
The Western governments and media are backing the new government in Kiev, not very surprisingly, because it consists of pro-Western forces, primarily from Western Ukraine, who want to see Ukraine join the EU and, if they can, NATO. Also involved in this coalition are the forces of the extreme right, again primarily from Western Ukraine. The best known group is called Right Sector, who were very active in the Euromaidan protests in Kiev that brought down the Yanukovych government.
Well, I think the Western governments take the issue of hegemony very seriously indeed. It's one thing for there to be some kind of popular uprising against a dictator or against an unpopular regime, but it is quite another for a completely separate country to annex a neighbouring territory. And that is a step too far, as perceived by the West and indeed by mainstream media.
At an early stage in the developments in the Ukraine, Western powers appeared to be backing armed protesters intent on overthrowing what was technically an elected government in Kiev. Thereafter, the Western powers appeared to be supporting the government in oppressing protesters in that same country. Is that a contradiction? Here's the view of the public. The West actually backed the armed protesters who overthrew the technically elected government in Kiev. Then they backed the new government who attacked protesters. Is there any sense of contradiction in our policies there?
Yeah, patently, because it's obvious from what I've read that there is a range of anti-Russian feeling from some fairly right-wing groups through to what presumably are moderates, or just those who are concerned that they don't want to go back under the Russian sort of protective umbrella.
It is a total contradiction, and then there's so many different opinions and then so many different leaders, and as usual it's quite difficult to get the information and follow a certain leader. So that is why so many people, so many different leaders, so many different opinions. It's the usual situation, this mess basically.
I'm sure there is. It's not cut and dry. I can't pretend to know that in detail, but it wouldn't be the first time there's such a contradiction, yes.
Well, what do you have in mind there?
Well, no, just generally there's, I guess, whether it be the US or Europe, in terms of the weapons of mass destruction and all those things that happened a few years ago, I guess there's always some politics, a lot of politics involved, so the contradiction doesn't surprise me.
The West originally backed armed protesters who overthrew an elected government, and then they supported a government which attacked armed protesters. So it seems to be a certain contradiction going on there in terms of Western policy. What's your view about that?
I think it probably reflects some of the geopolitics, and the West, including America, has been quite keen to do sort of rattling some cages, probably in order to sort of face down Putin, but he's not a man that's going to be faced down. So I think there's probably an element of hypocrisy in the way that the West have acted.
It's sort of classic British foreign policy. Look what we did in Iraq. We actually funded the Iraqis against the Iranians in that war, and then we suddenly turned sides. That's what we do. That's British foreign policy. We punch above our weight, you know, and we talk crap, and we actually just, you know, we're always doing U-turns.
Oh yeah, definitely. But there usually is, as there was with the whole sort of Syria crisis as well, and you get the West kind of funding sort of weapons. And the sort of rebels generally you'll find behind the scenes to sort of create this unrest, and then they kind of come in and want to play the heroes and save the day, it seems, very often.
So we see a degree of insight and also an element of confusion amongst the public's interpretation of what looked like shifting allegiances by Western powers when it comes to the Ukraine. We turn to our experts to see if they could unpick and clarify the actual dynamics when it comes to Western interests in the Ukrainian situation.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that the primary reason why Yanukovych was overthrown was not because of armed protesters, although there were armed protesters, but because many of the huge business oligarchs who dominate Ukraine economically and politically, who had backed him, decided to ditch him. But it's certainly true that the West portrays Yanukovych's overthrow as a popular insurrection, and it has a great difficulty in explaining why it's bad that people in the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine who are afraid of the new government, particularly because of their Russian connections, it's a contradiction to say that these people are bad and behaving illegally, but the protesters in Kiev are somehow good. It's a contradiction that is only really explicable in geopolitical terms. In other words, the protesters in Kiev are largely pro-Western, and the protesters in the south and east of Ukraine are looking towards Russia.
Well, I certainly wouldn't accept that the West backed armed protesters, or that there was any kind of armed coup in Kiev or anywhere else in the Ukraine for that matter, backed by Western forces. There is no doubt that the sympathies of the West and Western media, of course, with the protesters. And few can deny that although the regime came into power with great optimism, the reality is that it sank into terrible corruption.
If you were the Foreign Secretary in the United Kingdom, what policy would you recommend with regard to the Ukraine, or perhaps no policy at all? That's the question we asked the public, and this is their response. What do you think should happen about the UK government's apparent double standards in the Ukraine? What should happen in terms of our policy towards the situation?
Yeah, well, I think it should be a bit more standoffish, really, rather than being particularly involved. Yeah.
Do you think we've been meddling too much?
Yeah, I do really. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
My sort of human instinct says that there is some serious laws have been broken by Russia, and that Ukraine should be assisted to defend its borders.
Interfere, but let them choose. Like, let them ask the questions and say, this is what we need help with. If they don't ask for any help, then don't interfere.
What should happen to UK government policy towards Ukraine in that case? I suppose it ties in a little bit with what you said.
I don't really think we need to have a policy towards Ukraine. I just think it's an independent country, and we don't owe them anything, and they don't owe us anything, and they don't want us to interfere, I don't think.
Back off. We don't want them. They're poor. We don't want them in Europe. This is awful, isn't it, to say that? But, we don't need them in Europe. Actually, we should get out of Europe, frankly. We just certainly don't want Ukraine. I think we should let the Russians have it.
I think we want to go and sit down and talk to Putin. I mean, there's got to be a dialogue, because with the recent killings in Ukraine, the ambush and so forth, it's potentially very serious, and I don't think it's in anyone's interest to have a shooting war. And so I think we have to start talking. We have to start getting to talk to Putin first, show him some respect. He is leader of a very powerful country. He may not be right, he may not behave in the way we like, but I think we have to open up that dialogue.
So no clear opinion amongst all of the members of the public about what Britain's policy should be. We turn to our experts to see if there is a more definitive decision about what Britain should be doing in regard to the Ukraine.
Where do you start? I mean, in some ways, I think this is what we're seeing is the latest expression of two things. First of all, the way in which the British state has been locked into the alliance with the United States ever since the Second World War, and the extent to which British foreign policy is integrated into American foreign policy. This, I think, ever since 9/11, has been reinforced by the way in which successive British governments, Blair and Brown and now Cameron, have aligned themselves with the war on terror. It's really embarrassing to listen to William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, talking about Ukraine, because it's so biased, one-sided and misleading.
I would not accept that there has been any manifestation of double standards, except to the point that I think that the European Union was very unwise to cultivate Kiev as a potential member of the European Union and maybe down the line as a member of NATO. And that I quite understand the Kremlin taking the view that this was a step too far. But what has happened since with the annexation of territory is completely unacceptable in the modern world, particularly where there are subscribers to the United Nations involved.
And so we come to the last of our questions. Would it be the responsibility of the West, or is the West even in some way to blame if a regional conflict developed from the Ukrainian situation? If the region descends into an all-out war, do you think the West has to bear any of the responsibility or indeed the blame for that?
I think they probably do. I read people like Robert Fisk in The Independent, who says the West have probably acted rather irresponsibly. They contributed to Putin feeling a bit insecure, surrounded. He saw other states that sort of joined, neighbouring states that joined NATO. So that was bound to make sort of Russia feel uncomfortable, and it's probably no surprise they've acted in the way that they have.
That's a difficult one. There's always complicated, reasons behind a war, and I'm sure the West are involved somewhere. But I, couldn't say exactly where. But I'm sure they could carry some of the blame. Yeah, sure.
Oh, it's a very difficult question, isn't it? I'm sure there's some level of responsibility, but that doesn't mean that we don't do anything either. And so, I think the bigger question is, well, do we then take an active part? And that's something that I think most people would not like to do.
How would you feel if we did?
Oh, I'd be pretty fearful that we start to then exceed our own levels of authority, if you like. And while the cause might be honourable, it may be going a bit too far.
If it descends into a full-scale regional war, do you think we need to take any responsibility either to sort it out or any of the blame for allowing that to happen?
Responsibility and blame. Blame's a hard one. I don't know what the answer to that is. In terms of responsibility, I don't think there is the appetite in the West to go in, either politically or within the greater community. I think there's obviously a concern when you see situations like this. Some of the Balkans, we got enormously wrong. I think there's a big moral issue about the West's reaction to the Balkans. But these things aren't very simple. You can't just sort of, it's not a black and white scenario. I think possibly we just have to sit and watch and probably wring our hands. Seems to be the Western approach.
The West has got responsibility to make sure it doesn't, bleed into other areas, to help other countries defend their borders, and stop the spread of violence.
Okay, so should we allow ourselves to be drawn into this war if asked to do so by one side or the other?
I think a measured approach is probably best. We shouldn't take extreme action unless the circumstances are that bad that it really means we need to stop, to save lives. I don't think we should be heavy-handed. What we should do, just keep the pressure up on all the parties, to especially Russia, to not, to not land grab and invade or overtake more of Ukraine.
I think it has a responsibility for having supported, yes, and therefore I think it has a responsibility not to necessarily intervene with force, but certainly to intervene very strongly diplomatically. Yeah.
Are we to blame for the situation at all?
I think I suspect, I'm not, again, it's kind of beyond my real area of knowledge, but I suspect we have played a part, and therefore I suspect we do. I think we encouraged what was, in effect, not a legitimate protest. And I'm also very confused by this whole thing about the Russians talk about the right. Did we really support fascists, or is that the Russians using language that we wouldn't recognize? But there is confusion there, so I can't give a very clear opinion on that.
Blame, responsibility, simple words leading to difficult and challenging answers. We asked our experts if they really could work out whether the West is responsible for, or even to blame for, the evolving situation in the Ukraine.
I think in the first instance there would be a considerable responsibility for the Kiev government, who is now trying to force compliance from people in the south of and east of Ukraine through military force, and particularly is using the very dangerous tactic of sending right-wing nationalist militias into the east, which has led to horrific incidents like the deaths of over 40 people in Odessa a couple of weeks ago. Western governments, certainly in uncritically backing up the Ukrainian government's resort to force, would bear considerable responsibility. I think one also has to say that Russia also is pursuing its own interests without much care for the interests of the people of Ukraine, and has grabbed Crimea and has this big military build-up on the border. So I'd say that if there were war, a lot of people would be guilty, but certainly Western governments would have a significant share of the blame.
I think that it is quite likely that there will be civil conflict on a major scale within the Ukraine, and that is a great tragedy. I can see what's taken place in the Crimea, where particularly the Russian speakers have been disadvantaged by the Ukraine government from Kiev, that has insisted on, for example, only the use of the Ukrainian language. And I've visited the Crimea often enough to see that discrimination for myself. But that is really absolutely no excuse for any kind of process of annexation.
The West is playing a dangerous game of double standards in Ukraine. First, it supported armed protesters who took over government buildings and deposed former President Viktor Yanukovych in Kiev. Then it moved on to support the new government's action against protesters. It's ugly and it's contradictory, and it's very hard to see who wins. But what is sure is that whatever happens next, the losers will be the Ukrainian people and the credibility of the West.